So the next one is something you don't see too often from anywhere in the world, let alone from Australia.
Okay.
This is one single vineyard of what we call Mataro, Mourvedre, Monastrell. I don't know why we started calling it Mataro, but Paul Draper, one of my favourite winemakers in California, calls it Mataro, so at Ridge, so I'm happy to call it Mataro. This is an old vineyard planted about 90 years ago. I'd make this and I make another, the single vineyard, single varietal, and I make a Grenache called the Les Amis too, so these two are sort of like a match pair if you like. Mataro has been one of those varieties that's really been considered not anything particularly exciting. I love it, I think it's fantastic stuff. It's pretty difficult to work with, I think that's why a lot of people have never really sort of paid it too much attention. You know, it can be biennial bearing in the vineyard, you've really got to understand ripeness levels, there's nothing to do with sugar or anything, you've really got to understand when it's ripe. And the difference when it finally does get ripe is quite amazing. Of course it normally takes a bit of heat, you know, that's why it's down in Bandol in the Southern Rhone, because it's not grown in Hermitage, you know, because, let alone Cote Rotiers, because it needs that warmth and heat in the extended ripening season to get it fully ripe. It can be very, very tannic. Of course the French ones, from places like Bandol and so on, can have that real animal sort of funk to them. I like it, but a lot of people don't like that, so I personally like that character. This doesn't though. Australian Mataro is made properly, and there's, you know, I'm not the only one. Dean Hewitson makes some really good ones. There's other people as well, but you know, I think Mataro is a very underrated variety. But I actually had great fun with this. You know, Jancis Robinson's a good friend of mine. I said Jancis quite regularly in London. We had dinner together a couple of years ago, and Jancis said to me, you know, Dave, why do you persist in calling Mataro on the back label instead of Mourvedre? And I said, well, I actually read this really snooty English wine writer once wrote that anybody that calls Mourvedre Mataro thinks it doesn't make very good dry red. So I decided to make a single vineyard, single varietal Mataro, call it Mataro, and also make it the most expensive bottle of Mourvedre Mataro Monastrell in the world. And she said to me, that's preposterous, who would write that? And I said, well, you've got a short memory, Jess, it was you. So,
yeah.
So this is my ode to Jancis Robinson. And don't get me wrong, I've got a huge amount of respect for Jess. She's English and I'm Australian, we have to, you know,
absolutely,
we have to try and beat them up, that's our lot in life.
Now can you, this is an 05, and
yep.
Can you just speak a little bit about the current string of vintages?
Sure. Well, we've had, these vintages, 09 was one of the best we've had for a long time. In fact, I think it's the greatest vintage I've seen for almost 30 years for Grenache in the Barossa. 07 was a warm, dry one. You really have to know who your winemakers are in 07. I actually love the 07s, particularly because they have they're much more approachable. It's very similar to 07 in Europe, if you think about it. They're big wines. They probably don't have the longevity of some of the cooler years. I'm talking about cooler for Barossa terms now. But at saying that, the 07s are really good, you know, now they're 5 years old, are actually drinking quite well, whereas some of the cooler vintages, like 05, you can see this thing's a baby. I mean, it's tight and it's 7 years old, and yet it's still quite tight and closed. But if you think about Mataro, you realise how this is completely different to what you'd see out of, you know, this is it almost has the structure of a Barolo, you know what I mean? It has a completely different tannin structure and all the rest about it. And the other interesting thing about this one, it's been 2 years in brand new Tronçais Barrique, which is about, you know, one of the most powerful of the French forests, and yet there's absolutely no hint of the oak whatsoever. It just goes to show how much fruit there is that it can soak up 2 years of 100% new oak.
It's funny that you said Barolo. There's almost, I get a little bit of almost like an orange peel into that, which is I associate very much with Barolo or European wine in particular.
Yeah. But it's not like what you'd expect out of Mourvedre, you know what I mean? It's sort of, which, as I said, I love. I mean, don't get me wrong. You know, and every year, in fact, this year at the harvest, I had my favourite winery in Bandol is a little place called Domaine de la Tour de Bon, and the owner, she's a good friend of mine. Her daughter actually worked harvest for me this year, and I no doubt will send my son one day to go and work there. So I love that part of the world. It's just that, you know, the wines are different. Simple as that. I was at Tempier recently, this is a year or so ago. In fact, I met from a restaurant yesterday who was actually at Tempier the last time I visited. And I gave Daniel, the winemaker, a bottle of this, and so we ended up having it over lunch. And he said, it's amazing, this is just like the same grape variety. In fact, the original cuttings would have come from probably pretty close to him, and yet the wine ended up being, you know, completely different. So the Sturi is the first of my old vine Shirazes. We obviously have the woodcutter Shiraz with Shiraz entry point wine. The Sturi is the first of the old vine Shirazes, and I personally think a vineyard is not mature until it's 40 or 50 years old. The woodcutters, the vineyards are 15 to 25, but in saying that, we keep the yields down, so that's how we get nice concentration. Sturi vineyards are about 50 to 70 years old. The interesting thing about this, you can see from the label, it says Barossa. We're all the other say Barossa Valley, because in Australia we have what we call geographic indicators, or GIs, like the AVAs in California.
Okay.
So the umbrella region is called Barossa, and underneath that you have the Barossa Valley and the Eden Valley. So the Barossa Valley is in the west, and the Eden Valley is in the east. This wine, 2/3 of the fruit comes from the Barossa Valley. In fact, more importantly, the northwestern quadrant of the Barossa, where I live and work. So you get the richness, the dark chocolate, the dark berry, all that sort of stuff. But you've got to be careful you don't end up with too much of a good thing. So 1/3 of it comes from the Eden Valley, which is only 10 miles to the east of us, but it's 200 metres higher, well-drained sandy loams. You know, you get more red berry spectrum, a bit of elegance. So it's sort of like the best of both, if you like. You get the power, but also the lift.
And as a generalization, a little bit cooler, probably.
Oh, Eden Valley, absolutely, yeah, absolutely. Spends 18 months in wood, all French oak, barrique. Only about 20% of the barrels are new though. You know, all the places I've worked over the years, I've always sort of learnt that, you know, the fruit's supposed to be more about the, you know, the soil and the vineyard rather than the vessel it's stored in.